In previous video, we discussed about DBT generic test and especially the built-in generic tests provided by DBT like not null, unique, relationships and accepted values. But what if your business logic requires something more specific and is not covered by these four scenarios? For example, age should be like the minimum age should be 18 years, or there is a column which cannot have negative values. So, in these situations, we cannot use the generic built in test. Instead, we will have to write our own test, and these are what are called as custom generic test because we're going to apply these on multiple columns, not like singular tests which can only be applied to one particular model and one particular scenario. And these are the custom generic tests which we're going to cover in this particular video. If you're new here, then I am Radhika and this is my YouTube channel DataZart. We are continuing our DBT series. If you have not watched the previous videos, then I highly recommend watching those and then coming back to this video. And now without further ado, let's get started. Now, as with everything in DBT, generic tests are also defined as SQL files. So again, we are creating an SQL file. Now the thing is, where do you store these files? Because where you store determines how that file is going to be used. If you store that in models, it's going to be a model. If you're going to store this file in test, then it's going to be a test. So for our generic test, we can define these in two different places. The first place is you can go into your test directory and in that create another directory called as generic and then define your .sql file. You can put in any name and always remember that use intuitive names so that you know what each test is doing. So this is the first place where you can define it, and the other place is you can define this in macros directory. So where you have your macros stored. Now why we are creating these SQL files in macro? Because these generic tests, they are working like a macro, because in these SQL files we are parameterizing the SQL query, and by parameterizing, which this means that we are creating a template. We are creating a macro in which we are going to update the model name and the column name so that we can use these multiple times. So we will have here model name, we will have here column name, because that's how we're going to parameterize this. We have already discussed this in depth in the previous video, so I would highly recommend watching that one first before coming over here. So these are the two places where you can define your SQL files for creating these generic tests. Now in this SQL file, what happens? So in this SQL file, what you will do is, this is our .sql file, you will create a test block. And in this test block, you will write your select statement, which will define your query, which will define what rows you want to capture so that you can identify whether that test has failed or not. So you're going to define a select statement anyways. Now in this test block, you will have two things. There are two arguments that this test block should have. First is model and the second one is the column name. Now you can define these tests on multiple things like multiple resources, like you can define this on a source, on a seed or a snapshot, but this first argument to this test block will always be called as model no matter on which resource you're applying the test. So always remember this. And then the column name. So this is the column on which you need to define your test. This is an optional argument. Why? Because some of the tests you might be applying this directly at model level, not at the column level. So this is a mandatory argument and this one is an optional argument. And this is, again, it could be any resource, but you will always say this as a model. This is how generic tests are defined. It will make more sense when we will be doing the practical implementation, but I want to give you the basics before we start implementing these. And as with the other tests as well, if this SQL file, when we run this test, if 0 records are found, then this means the test has passed. And if there are n number of records, then this means that the test has failed. Now let us try to practically implement this in our project. Now I'm in my project and let us go to our test folder, and currently here we have 3 singular tests defined. Now it is time to define a custom generic test. So I'm going to create a new folder over here and I'm going to call this generic, and in here I'm going to define the first generic test, and all I want to do is ensure that our age is always greater than 18, which means this test should capture those rows where age is less than 18. So let us create this test. So I'm going to create a new file in the generic folder and I'm going to call this test less than 18.sql. This is an SQL file. We first have to define our test block, and to do this, the way to do this is you create curly braces, and in that you add %sign at both the ends, and in between these %sign you will write a test block. So first you will write test, this is the keyword, and then you will write the name of your test, and the name of your test I usually use this as same as our file name. So I'm going to call this test less than 18, because that's what my file name is, and it will contain two arguments. First is model and the other one is column name. So now we are defining this test. Next, because we have started this block, we have to end it as well, and similar to how we have started it, we have to add two curly braces, and in between these we'll have %sign, and in between the %sign we just say end test. And in between this test block we are going to write our select statements. Let us first fetch that particular column. So I'm going to write CTE with validation as. Here I'm just going to capture that particular column which we want to test on. So I'm going to say select, and we know that the column name is coming from this argument, and the way to use this argument is using Jinja template. So I'm going to create a separate video on what Jinja templates are, but I'll try here to explain you how these templates are used. So in double braces, whatever you write, you can grab the value of particular variable. So here column name is our variable and we want to grab this column name. So I'm writing this in a Jinja template, and then we're going to use this as test column from, and now we know that our model name, our table name is coming from this argument. So we can use this over here, and again we have to wrap this inside a curly brace. So this is how I'm going to fetch my column. Now I'm going to say I'm creating another CTE which is called as validation errors, and here all I'm doing is, now here I'll write my statement. Select our test column from validation, where now we write our condition, where test underscore column, whatever our column name is less than 18, because those rows we want to capture. Because as soon as I know these are the rows where our age is less than 18, I know that these are the ones which we need to be flagged. These are the failed rows. So that's what I'm capturing here, and I'm just going to now do select star from validation errors. So you see how simple it is to write a generic test. You create a test block, and the way to create is using curly braces and then a %sign. You write test here, test is the keyword. This is just like def in your def in Python, if you know about Python programming language. So this is just like that. Then this is the name of your test. I usually keep it same as the name of the file here. And then you can have model name and column name. So these are the two arguments which should always be there. These are the minimum arguments that have to be there in this test block. Then you write your CTE. So in the first CTE, all I'm doing is I'm capturing that particular column which I want to test. And in the second CTE, I'm saying I'm adding that condition that this column should be less than 18. I want to pick all those rows. And then I'm just saying select star from these validation errors. And this is how you end this test block that you have created at the top. Now let us save this. Now the next thing that must be coming to your mind is, okay, we have set the model and the column. How do we pass this information? And this is similar to what we were doing in the generic built-in tests. We will have to go into the YAML file, and in that YAML file we'll have to define where we want to apply this test, which model and which column name. So let's do that. Now I don't want this test to be in my sources, because in source we generally do not test for these things. All we check for usually is not null values and accepted values, etc. So I'm going to be using this test in my models. So the first model in which I'm going to use this in the bronze model. So in bronze model we have age. So I'm going to say data tests over here because that's how you define the test property. And then we can just use the name of the test. So this was test less than 18. Oops, EIGHTEN. This is the test that we want to use, and like we were doing for the built-in test, we can define the description. So description, every employee record should have age 18 or more. This is what I'm defining for description. So this is what I want to test, and I can also define the severity. So in config we can define severity, and I want this as warning. I don't want to fail this pipeline. I just want this as a warning so that I can go to the source system and check with them why the employees are coming as less than 18. Now let us just save this. So the way this works is we are telling this is the test we want to use. So it's going to go into this SQL file. Then it's capturing the model name and the column name from here. And this is what is being passed to this in model and column name. And that's how the full query is working. Now it is time to run our DBT test, and I'm only going to run our test on this particular model. So whatever tests are defined over here, those are the ones that are going to be run. We only have currently one test defined, so this is the only one that's gonna be run. Now for this we have to do DBT test and then select and then write our model name. So our model name is bronze HR data. So now you will see that we're just running one test, that is test less than 18 on bronze HR data, and the column is age, and it has passed. So you can see that how easy it is to run these custom generic tests. So now you can see that the 3 steps of running a test is first you define the test. That is what we are doing in our tests directory in generic directory, and then defining our SQL file as a test block. And then once we have defined it, we have to use it on which model and column this test applies to. And this is done in the YAML file. So we went into our model file because we wanted to apply this test on the bronze model. And then we chose the column on which you need to apply the test. And then we have added the test over there. And then once we have done that, we did DBT test. What that DBT test did is it went into this file, added the model and column that we have defined, updated this, and then ran that test. If you want to see the compiled test version, all you can do is go into the target folder. So let's go here, then compiled, DBT HR analytics, then models and bronze, and then in bronze.yml we will have our test. So as you can see here, if you go to this file with validation as select age, so it has got that age from the YAML file as test column, and then it has got the full model HR analytics bronze and bronze HR data, and then we are running this particular query. So when you run this, it will give you the test results if there are failed records or not. Now let us go one step deeper. I'm going to again create a test, but this time what I want is there are columns like, if you go over here in the bronze.yaml, there are columns like daily rate. So we want that this daily rate should be 100 or more. We don't want any values less than 100. Or there could be a different column like hourly rate. So let's go to hourly rate. So here also we need some kind of test for a minimum value of hourly rate. Our data should not have any rows which are less than that particular value. So you see here the common pattern. We want a minimum threshold. If the value falls below that, we want to flag it. So should we be creating different generic test for these? Absolutely not. We can have another argument in the test block to define what is that minimum threshold. Let's do that. So I'm going to create another test. So let's go into our test folder in generic folder, and then let us create another file. I'm going to call this test less than a particular value.sql, and this value we are again going to pass this from the YAML file. We'll see that how this is done. I'm saying increasing the complexity, but it is not very complex. It's really easy. So like always, we first have to define our test block. So to do that, we have to add our curly braces and then percent sign. And in between this percent sign, we're going to first write test as the keyword, because this is what tells DBT this is a test. And then we are going to write test less than val, my test name. And then we have to pass our arguments. Our first argument should always be model. Our second argument should always be column name. Now we can pass a third argument, which is called as, you can name it anything, I'm calling this as val for value. Now I'm going to end this test as well. So I'm going to write percent and then end test. And in between we have to write our select statement. So for select statement, again, I'm first capturing that particular column. So I'm going to say with validation as, and here I'm going to say select. We want to capture that column. It's coming from the column name. So I'm going to say in Jinja templates, column name from our model. So our model, again using the template, and I will just rename this column as test column. This is simple SQL. We are just parameterizing it using these Jinja templates. Now again, I'm going to write that validation errors query. So validation errors, again, this is my second CTE as, and then what we need to do is we need to select this test column from validation. Now we have to define our condition where this test column is less than the value that we are passing. When any row comes which satisfies this condition, then we know that our test has failed and we have to investigate what has happened. So this is exactly what we are doing here. Now we have just defined the test. We still have to use it so that this test gets value for model, column name and val. And to do this, I'm again going to go into the bronze models.yaml file, and I'm first going to go into this daily rate column in the bronze HR data model, and here I'm going to define data tests. Now the test name, so test less than val, and then we can give its description. We can say that we are assuming that I've added this description. We are assuming that the minimum daily rate of employees cannot be less than 100. So we are checking here if there are any employees whose daily rate is less than 100. So this is what we have added as description. I've added in the wrong place. Let's do it over here. Now remember that from here we are just getting the model name and column name, but we also have to pass that val argument. So to do that, because it is an argument, so you write arguments, and then here you define whatever your argument name is. So val, and then I'm saying minimum value is 100. Now we can again define the config like we were defining for other tests, and again severity is 1 or error, whatever you like. Let's save this. Now from here we have our model name, we have our column name, and we also have our value. So we have everything that we need to run this particular test. Now I said that we can use this for any column with any value. So let's go into our hourly rate column, and in this hourly rate, again I'm going to define this data test. Test name is test less than val, and here we can define the description, and this time the description that I want is the minimum hourly rate is the in business is 28. If any employee hourly rate falls below this value, then we need this to be raised as an error. So I'm writing this as description, and now we have to pass our val argument, because this time the value for val argument is 28. So I'm going to say arguments, then val, and we need the value as 28. And now again we can define the config severity as error. So you see how easy it was to define just one generic test. We have three arguments here and we can change the third argument as well. We are saying for daily rate it is 100, for hourly rate it is 28. So you see how easy it is to use these custom generic tests for multiple columns. Now let us just run this test. So I'm going to do dbt test, select, I'm just going to run this on bronze HR data. So I'm writing bronze HR data. Now you will see that there are three tests that are being run. We have some problem in our SQL. Oh, we forgot to write select star from validation errors. I have not completed my select statement. Now let us clear this and run this again. So the error is because this val is actually a variable, so we have to enclose this in brackets. That's why dbt was failing. Now this should work. So let us run this again. I have incorrectly stated data test here. This should be data test, and that is why dbt was not able to figure that this is also a test. So I've updated this. Now let me try to run this again, and I hope it gets fixed this time and we have three tests. Yes, we do. So now you can see that our first test is the test less than 18 on our age column, which is pass. Then test less than value, this is for daily rate 100, this is also passed. And the last one is test less than value for hourly rate as 28 at its value, and it has failed. And this means that there are rows in the data set where our hourly rate is less than 28. There are rows in our data set, in our bronze HR data, where hourly rate is less than 28, and there are 142 such rows. So this is what is being flagged by dbt. So it is raising this as an error. And if we have to find out what are those rows, then we can just go to target, then compiled, and then models, bronze, and then bronze models, and then we can just go to this hourly rate query. Like, this is the compiled version, and we can just copy this, go to our Snowflake and run it over here. So you will see that these are the 142 rows flagged, and if you want, you can just update this query to say employee number, whatever you want to view, employee number and this, and then again employee number. And then when you run this query, you will be able to see for which employee number this test column, that is our hourly rate, is less than 28, and these get flagged. And now you can fix the issue. You can go to the source system, talk to them and figure out what's the problem and fix it from there on. So you see how easy it is to define these generic tests first in SQL file, then use them in .yaml file, and then do dbt test in your terminal to run these tests and find out if there are any failed rows or not. Now I am just defining these two generic tests, but you can choose any of your choice, and I highly recommend think of a scenario where a generic test would be useful. Write that particular test and try it out yourself, and if you get stuck anywhere, revisit this video to understand how to implement it. I have already built this bronze models.yaml file, so I'm going to copy the contents over here and push this in GitHub repository so that you can access all the contents and the way I have written all these tests, what are the configurations that I have used for these tests. You can see this from the GitHub repository. To push this on GitHub, I'm going to clear this. I'm first going to check the git status, and we know that we have changed this bronze __ models.yaml file, and we also have some untracked files. So let's add all of these, and now I'm again going to check the status. So we have all of these changes added to our GitHub staging area. Now I'm going to do git commit, and I'm going to add message added custom generic tests, and now we're just going to do git push origin main to push this code on GitHub. As always, if you have any questions related to anything that I have mentioned, or if I have not covered anything, then please put that question in the comments below, and I promise I will get back to you. If you found this video helpful, or if you have any suggestions for me to improve on, then please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And if you have not subscribed to my channel, then please do subscribe, as I don't want you to miss out on any future videos. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next one.